think I could have gone right off and forgot it.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, to pick up
I have
from,
a 2-hour Zoom now. Can you
okay,
wait till 8 or should I do the hamburgers in between? Because I
Oh,
I ain't gonna eat lunch.
Karen's, we're getting her meal planning. I'm
Oh,
gonna,
forgot to mute.
that's okay.
you've been recorded for all time, Karen.
Right. So I'm going to mute also because I have dogs and I can't trust they won't start barking,
Okay.
but I'll unmute for things.
Okay. So there we go. Well, to pick up on from where we left off with the development and of the technological changes that occurred in the interwar years leading up to the war and so on, I began to address some of the conflicts that took place just prior to the outbreak of the war, the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, the Spanish Civil War, for example. So conflicts were still occurring around the globe, and a number of places didn't reach our level of attention that those did, but nonetheless were important. And we'll hit that particularly when we discuss more about China and Japan. But what I wanted to emphasize in this coming section is what I've outlined here. The central role of diplomacy began to weaken. And during this period of time, this buildup, it became apparent, particularly to France and England, and to a lesser degree, but still importantly, even with Russia, that Germany was now undertaking preparations which ultimately appeared to have only one realistic outcome. That was that there was going to be a war. Now, as with all of us psychologically, and this is true of our leaders because they are, after all, human beings, that we seek to avoid conflict. You'll see it in our own discourse. We try to avoid verbal conflicts. We certainly do a great deal to try to avoid violent interpersonal conflicts, and the same holds true of nations. But as things begin to move forward, there may occur in some people's minds a certain level of inevitability about what's going to happen. And in this situation, it becomes the responsibility of governments to take a cold-hearted view of what this change in the international arena is going to reflect, and how do you prepare, in a sense, for the worst case scenario. All of us, I think, are old enough to remember growing up during the early parts of the Cold War, where we were taught to hide under our desks in the case of a nuclear attack, or in some situations actually built bomb shelters. We were preparing for the worst, even if we hoped that we would be able to avoid that. One of the key elements that happened in this particular period of time was that one leader in particular, Adolf Hitler, had actually written a book about his ultimate aims. And the interesting element for diplomats, not just for general populations who didn't bother to read the book, but in the circles of government, people who did read the book tended to discount what Hitler's aims ultimately were, or if not discount them entirely, to believe that diplomacy alone could deter him from certain actions. And that's not to say that Hitler would have necessarily gone to war the way in which he did, but there was a certain direction in which he was headed that basically meant violent conflict was going to come. The only remaining question was against whom and how pervasive would that conflict be. Now, many historians, many of us, hold the opinion that Hitler was basically an idiot for going to war, to World War II. But within the context of the time, as I tried to point out both during the lectures on the interwar years and during this particular set of lectures, he actually exhibited considerable brilliance. And this very brilliance led him almost inexorably to a path which resulted in a violent conflict. And we're going to discuss a little bit of that as we go through the next set of slides. So here he is. He certainly doesn't appear to any of us nowadays to be an imposing figure. And at times it's sort of hard to imagine how a person with this physiognomy would capture the enthusiasm of a country to the degree that he did. And I think it is not possible to really step away from that particular element. He really did engage the vast majority of the German population, even if the majority were not members of the Nazi Party. His particular diplomatic actions, which I'm not going to discuss in detail here, but I'm just going to outline for us to look at, is that he accomplished all of these things within a remarkably short period of time. Most of these that were accomplished with little threat of conflict. The movement into the Rhineland, yes.
Your slide did not advance. Are you?
Are
we supposed to be looking at the Hitler slide?
No. Let me.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Share. It
Are we
says
still
you are
at
screen sharing.
No, I don't mean that, but I mean, I'm sorry, I might be screwing you up. Are we still on the Demon of War slide then?
No, I've gone to the third slide, Hitler's diplomatic.
Okay, so it didn't advance to the middle of the screen. It's on the side still.
All right, let me.
That would have to do with the PowerPoint.
Yep, let me. Is that showing it?
Yeah, now we're on Hitler. Yeah, okay, now.
Okay, so that's what it took.
Okay.
All right, let me just do one last thing then. Okay, is it still showing? Is it showing?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay, all right. Sorry,
Okay.
something must have gotten messed up. As we can see here, the rejection of the Treaty of Versailles was not something in itself that would occasion an armed conflict, nor did the rearmament. But when he moves into the Rhineland, that's the first aggressive military action that's taken, even though France and Britain, and especially the United States, had really wanted nothing much more to do with the Rhineland. So they allowed that to happen. The incorporation of Austria into the Reich was both an event coming from the outside, that is, the German military actually did drive into Austria and occupy it, but there was a lot of internal difficulty within Austria itself that permitted this to happen without raising it to the level of conflict. And as we go on down, we'll notice that, and we talked about the Sudetenland and the conflict that occurred over that. It was very close to bringing armed conflict into the global arena, but fortunately was derailed. And I use the word fortunately meaningfully in this situation, was deflected by Chamberlain and Daladier basically locking out Bennis, not letting him have a say in the process, and turning over this land to Germany. And as it turns out, unknown to those powers, had it come to an armed conflict, senior officers in the German military were going to launch a coup against Hitler and get rid of him because they really didn't want to have a shooting war occur. Maybe that would have been the answer, but it's understandable that everyone wanted to avoid war and so on. But this particular success, which was followed within just a few months by the occupation of Czechoslovakia, meant that a coup attempt was not likely to happen. And indeed, although there were attempts to kill Hitler on a number of occasions, including the most notable one in July of 1944, none of those was successful. This particular gentleman, whom I misidentified in my last lecture when I mentioned about someone who wanted to accumulate wealth to himself. It wasn't Goebbels, it was Goering who did that. This is another person who had great importance and influence also in the Sudetenland situation, but took up head of the Luftwaffe. And as I also mentioned in the last lecture, rebuilt that organization to the point where Germany could claim parity with Britain and France, which again deterred them from wanting to go to war because both Britain and France in particular feared bombing of their cities. They felt that they could not protect them. And that was going to be a devastating effect, something which they would do their utmost to avoid. Now, the German leaders who were present at the time of growth of the German army and responsible for its modernization, I've outlined in part with von Seeckt in the last lecture, but now under Fritsch and Blumberg, all of whom helped organize the German military forces to the degree that they became as powerful as they did within a remarkably short period of time. As we've seen, interestingly, in Ukraine, that having so-called modern weapons avails you very little if you don't have the training and doctrine behind it. And indeed, as we'll see, when the conflict actually becomes open, that in some ways the German technology was in a number of places inferior to that of the French and the British and later on with the Russians. But because the doctrine was so well instilled into the military force that they could overcome those technological deficiencies with how they organized and fought. This particular person as well had tried to restrain Hitler in a number of different ways. He became not so much a vocal opponent that is publicly, but behind the scenes within the military. But as the Sudetenland outcome showed Hitler's political skill and his ability to outmaneuver France and Britain in particular, Beck ended up resigning, placed on the retired list, but later on engaged in the plot to try to kill Hitler in 1944. He attempted suicide. Apparently, when he shot himself, he didn't really quite kill himself, and he was finished off in his office. I mention this because this was the first real attempt. I'm not going to read the slide, but it emphasizes what I was talking about. Certain things that happened from the perspective of France and Italy and Britain and even the United States to deter war, to push it aside, had an unforeseen outcome, one which could not be known by those powers. And that was that Beck was ready to get Hitler removed from office. Okay, so what else was happening in the world? Well, these elements often are not discussed or revealed in most of the histories that we run across, but bear a great deal of importance to the direction the war took as the war continued from its alleged European onset, September 1st, 1939, up until its conclusion in 1945. There was, for example, a significant, though not a major conflict between Russia and Japan. We can recall from the last set of lectures and some of the things I said earlier in the first lecture that China had been basically in its northeastern segment overrun by the Japanese. They had taken that area for a variety of reasons, and it thrust the Japanese up against the Russian border. There were a series of conflicts that took place in 1937 near Vladivostok, the only warm water port that Russia had for its Far Eastern fleet in the Pacific region. And this ended up in a significant amount of fighting open conflict, but never got to the point where either side declared war. But that didn't end the conflict in that region. This shows a little bit of the distribution of forces, if you will, that occurred in that period of time. And if you look down in this lower corner, you'll see where Vladivostok is, and you'll see this tenuous railroad system that goes up here, and there's a railroad system that passes through here that allegedly could reach there, but this is under Japanese control. And over in this region, there was also to be another significant conflict that occurred. Now, why did it occur? The alleged reason for it was simply a matter, I'll go back to this slide and then come forward, was simply a matter of uncertain boundaries. So you could say, well, you know, we don't know if the boundary's there or if the boundary's here. That in itself is a relatively trivial matter when you really come down to an area that's as vast as we're looking at here. There had to be something else underneath it. From the Russian perspective, having been defeated by Japan in 1904-05 conflict, the Russo-Japanese War then, the Russians were in no mood, even though that had occurred under the Tsar, they were in no mood to have any threats against the rail line, which was necessary to support Vladivostok, the seat of the Far Eastern Fleet. Secondly, they had a strong desire to protect that border because the Japanese had already shown the willingness to encroach and threaten. They had the necessity from their perspective to resist that kind of action. And they didn't want to get into an open conflict with Japan, but they needed to have Japan restrained. This was going to be an issue for them. What about the Japanese? Well, from the Japanese standpoint, the army had been discussing a northern approach to the coming conflict. That is, that instead of fighting with the United States and Netherlands and France and Britain in the Southeast, which many of us have taken as the way it was going to be regardless, that wasn't the case. Internal discussions in the Japanese military and the relative autonomy that many Japanese leaders in this region enjoyed meant that they were thinking about pushing north. And if they could cut this rail line at some particular critical point, all of this territory would now become open to conquest. That's an important element to keep in mind. So the Japanese were indeed looking north, and they also felt that there was some possibility that Russia just could not muster the support necessary on this rail line to come in and defend this region. So again, nations tend to take advantage of perceived weakness. As a result, forces were built up on both sides. So they saw something coming. Again, we talked about that in the last lecture in terms of anticipating coming conflicts. And what you'll see here, and again, don't worry too much about the numbers though, is how, for example, the number of Soviet tanks rose from 1931 to 2,200. Aircraft from a few to 200 in 1932 to 2,500. In contrast, the Japanese had many fewer of both. But the Russians were at the end of a very long supply line, and that meant that numbers alone may not be sufficient. The disputed area is here. It's a relatively small area along this particular river line, and this led to considerable conflict, which broke out in 1939. This just shows how the Japanese initially enjoyed some success against the Russians. And while the offensive only lasted for a few days, they were able to push the Russians back almost across the river line, seeking to establish this as a firm border. However, within a short period of time, it became apparent that the Japanese military lacked certain capacities. One of these was, for example, anti-tank weaponry. And here you see a painting of Japanese soldiers with rifles and bayonets trying to pry their way into a stalled Russian tank. Similarly, the Japanese learned to their dismay that their particular weapons compared to Russian weapons were actually quite weak. And what we'll see here is that an example of what the Japanese called a medium tank, which in terms of definition really was more a matter of weight than a matter of capability. And the Japanese tended to use their tanks in cooperation with their infantry rather than in tank heavy units. The Russians, on the other hand, tended to have more powerful tanks, tended to have better armor, and tended to have more powerful weapons. And they tended also to try to concentrate them into tank heavy units. That had been based in part on principles that had been developed over a number of decades, particularly under the direction of Marshal Tukhachevsky. But Tukhachevsky was eliminated by Stalin during the Great Purges in 1937. And Russian armor doctrine had tended to fall apart at that point. And there wasn't the same degree of organization that would occur in the 40s once Russia and Germany were at each other's throats. Again, this is a medium tank according to a more developed Japanese scheme, but by comparison to Russian tanks, not as capable, not as able to fight and win in an open battlefield. The Soviets built up after their initial defeat in July. They used that rail line with great capability, considering the distances that had to be covered. And under new leadership, Marshal Zhukov were able to launch an offensive against the Japanese troops and really just wrecked them, demonstrated a capability which the Japanese could not master. You see all these designations down here as to the type of units involved, but it doesn't reveal some of the essential elements that really play a role in victory. And this isn't just a matter of numbers, although the Russians had those. It's also not just a matter of technology, though the Russians showed dominance, except in the air, although they had such greater numbers, it seemed to make no difference, but particularly in their doctrine, in the way they organize. For example, down here and here represent tank heavy units. And these concentrating armor power meant that once there was a breach broken by the infantry in an attack, the tanks could rush ahead into the rear, destroying supply depots, cutting off routes of supply, disrupting headquarters and artillery and things of that nature. And it was just devastating for the relatively road-bound, relatively immobile Japanese units. And this guy, who happened to be out in the Far East when the purges were going on and escaped being purged, came back to Moscow with a reputation that was markedly enhanced. And this fellow will not only survive the war, he will be one of the great generals of World War II. And we'll talk about him if we ever get to the Russo-Japanese conflict. The other thing that happened in 39, just diplomatically, was that Germany and Italy signed the Pact of Steel. Now, this is different from the Anti-Comintern Pact, which was directed against Russia Italy joined that, as did Japan. In this situation, this was Italy's commitment to join with Germany rather than join with Britain and France against Germany to restrain it. Part of the reason for that is this: Italy's rear was secured. It wasn't just a matter of the similarities of fascism and Nazism, a distinction I drew in the interwar years lectures and in the last lecture. This was a military decision on Mussolini's part, in good measure, to secure his northern border, or what we would consider the rear, so that Germany wouldn't invade Italy. And based on this, it also meant that Germany's southern border there was somewhat protected. But it also meant that from Germany's perspective, they had to shift a lot of resources to support Italy when she got into military conflicts. The other critical diplomatic effect was the Ribbentrop-Molotov agreement in August of 39. This fellow, Molotov, for whom the Molotov cocktail is mentioned, and we'll come to that a little bit later, was the chief negotiator with Germany in order to establish this pact. Now, Stalin had a great deal to do with Molotov being able to do anything, of course, but this particular arrangement with this fellow, Ribbentrop, who was the foreign minister, was designed to create a structure of peace between Russia and Germany in August of 39. Now, why was the timing important? There are a couple of repercussions here that were of very, very critical nature. Remember that by this time, by March of 1939, Hitler had occupied pretty much the rest of the Czech Republic. Slovakia, which had separated itself once the Sudetenland collapsed, became basically a puppet state of Germany. And now Poland alone stood as a barrier between East Prussia and Central Germany by the Polish corridor. And Hitler was not going to tolerate not having an overland communication, which he controlled, to East Prussia. In a sense, think of it again in terms of Ukraine and Russia, Russia wanting a land bridge down to Crimea from its border on the northern edge of the Black Sea, rather than count across a tenuous arrangement from the Kuban Peninsula into Kerch and into the rest of Crimea. So this pact was signed August 23. And the key thing here are manifest in the secret protocols that accompanied it. If there is a single diplomatic situation which basically allowed the European war to begin, in my view, it's this. Now, why would Stalin agree to this? Remember that Stalin had eliminated nearly all the top officers of the Soviet army. He had had millions who died of famine or were simply removed one way or another from the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics to gulags or were basically killed off. And he needed time to restructure his military. He needed time to rebuild his internal controls over the Soviet Union as a whole. He did not want to get into an immediate conflict with Germany, but he certainly viewed the threat from Germany as real. Remember that Hitler had designated communism as one of the key threats to the rise of Germany and is the key opponent which had to be eliminated. And this is in addition to Hitler's emphasis on getting free living spaces, he called it the Lebensraum, in the East. That could not come at the cost to France or Belgium or Netherlands. There just wasn't enough room there. He was looking east, which meant Poland, Ukraine, maybe Eastern Russia itself, certainly Belarus, and eventually possibly the Baltic states. The communists in France in particular were totally surprised by this action, and it undercut a lot of their opposition to the French government once they learned of this, and may have played an indirect role in why Britain and France were willing to, I'll use the word guarantee, that really wasn't quite accurate, but to guarantee the Polish borders. What was given up? Again, in the secret protocols, what we see here is that the Soviet Union would gain a substantial part of Poland. You see here it's designated as spheres of influence, but over here they basically annexed it. And this was true of a number of different areas that you'll see here that pushed the western borders of the USSR, for which I'm going to use the word Russia throughout these lectures, further to the west, and Germany's borders further to the east. Now, I got done saying that Russia wanted to avoid conflict with Germany. So how does this settle that issue? Well, first of all, it bought them time, because with the occupations that took place, it took time to control those areas sufficiently to deal with the local populations, install the government you want, and to have them act in a responsible manner towards your particular aims. The second part is it meant the heart of Russia was further away, if you will, from Germany, so that if Germany attacked Russia, they had further to go before they actually got to Mother Russia. So by moving your borders, you've created a buffer. It's given you more time. And this was of great importance. But in addition, remember that Stalin had eyes on a lot of different places that he wished to control. And the Baltic states were part of it because the important Russian naval base was up here. And if they didn't control this region, you can see that between Finland and Estonia and so on, access to the Baltic could be cut off. Whereas later on, this being taken over now, the Russian fleet is basically secure. It can't be harmed through here, and it can begin to control a part of the Baltic. So what happens now? The stage is set, diplomacy dies, and war comes out. And war comes out with a bang. This is a huge step. The invasion of Poland. Now, one of the key things I emphasized at the beginning of this series of lectures is that the European war was not really world war at this point. There were conflicts that took place around the globe, if you will, between Germany and Italy and France and England and so on. But anything outside the immediate European and Mediterranean theater at this time was really very, very slight. And if one applied the word world war to those minor engagements, why then the Napoleonic Wars were a world war, or the 7 Years' War was a world war. I mean, you just can't extrapolate that way. So this was the beginning of the European war. What happened? We're going to go through this because what happened to Poland served as a template for what was coming and what the rest of the world was looking at. The effectiveness of the German military in this situation was astounding. oftentimes it's portrayed as a modern nation beating a relatively backward nation, that is Poland. It tends to put Poland in the position of saying, you know, you're a big country, you had a big population, but frankly, you're second class, if not third class. You just really haven't got the infrastructure, you haven't got the technology to support your military, you haven't got the doctrine, which means in part, you haven't learned any lessons from World War I, and you haven't bothered to acknowledge the risk that Germany offers. Now, back in the early 1920s, roughly around 1922, Russia had invaded Poland and nearly taken Warsaw when they were beaten back and defeated. And that established Polish independence categorically until this particular event occurred. One would recognize, as was true of the time, that Poland feared Russia enormously. Well, if you got a big neighbor whom you fear, don't you adapt yourself to dealing with that? Well, Poland really didn't do that very well. And then when you have this rising power on your other flank and you're caught between the two, then your situation becomes dire. And you have a series of decisions and choices to make. Poland decided first that it would not make any arrangements with Russia. It feared the Russian bear, so it wouldn't do anything to acknowledge that it's perhaps its best interests lay with making some kind of accommodation with either Russia or with Germany. Instead, they said, we're going to fight. But in this particular situation, unlike what we're seeing in Ukraine now, the Poles just didn't have it in them. The organization of powers that you see here in red and blue emphasize the different force structures and locations. And it looks as though the Polish army is pretty darn big and pretty powerful. So it appears that although terrain does not favor Poland, this being a lot of flat open land subject to great maneuver, as opposed to these more mountainous regions, they still look like they've got a fairly powerful organization. The German High Command had moved under this man's control, but it was also pretty clear that Hitler was going to remain sort of the dominant figure through all of this. And some of the different leaders who were going to run the war had been trained, had grown up, not just through World War I, but had gone through that enormous training cycle and in-depth education that von Seeckt had started in the 20s and was continued throughout this period of time, adapting their weaponry to the tactics they wished to employ and adapting their tactics to the weaponry they would use. It was a full circle that became very well integrated and demonstrated its power in this particular opening conflict. So these are just different people whose names surface continuously if you read military histories of World War II. I'm not going to get into their biographies, it doesn't matter at this point. But some of them also later on became great opponents to Hitler himself and ended up in bad situations down the road for some of them. Okay, I'm just showing you some of these things. The opening moves that occurred, and again, this looks like a very busy slide, but just sort of look at the blue lines that we're seeing here, show that when you have the right kind of organization, in spite of what appears to be not a great dominance in numbers, but when you've got a better organization, a more coherent doctrine, and can employ this doctrine effectively because you've trained people in how to do it, how to put it all together, an enormously complex undertaking that you can use your troops to penetrate, get around the edges, and then drive deep into the interior, disrupting supplies, communication, command structures, and coordination. You can present threats to different parts of the country to which the Poles now are forced to respond. This is called giving up the initiative. And when you can say, I'm going to attack here or there, but you can only defend one of those two places with any degree of competence, then I'll go for the weaker spot. And in that regard, I've outmaneuvered you. Now, again, just for the way in which we are viewing the current conflict in Ukraine, to be able to do this, to drive these distances and engage forces as you do this effectively means that your whole supporting structure, your whole logistical support has to be organized and protected well enough for you to do it. This particular attack that was carried out by the Germans integrated the Air Force very closely with the ground forces, something that had been worked on in World War I, but the technology had not existed to the degree that I tried to demonstrate in the last lectures, where aircraft were specifically designed to aid the ground forces in a very particular manner. So the Stuka, for example, which is considered one of the most infamous or famous dive bombers in the German armament structure, was used to destroy points of resistance from the air and allow the ground forces to break through and get into the deep rear where they could disrupt function. And then when you no longer have coordinated forces that can cooperate with each other, you can be chewed up piecemeal. So this was an extraordinary achievement. And it's partly where the word blitzkrieg comes in, lightning war. The Germans never really used that term themselves to describe it. It was applied by the Allied forces that were watching this unfold. I put this fellow up here because Heinz Guderian was one of the key leaders who looked at the experiences of World War I and brought armored doctrine into play in the German forces as they built up in the 30s and began to establish their doctrine. He had learned lessons himself. He had read widely, including some of the British authors, Liddell Hart and JFC Fuller in particular, and applied these lessons to German war. Von Manstein was yet another person who later becomes extraordinarily prominent, and his name will surface when we come to the invasion of France. One of the things this demonstrates as well that I've talked about is to look at the technology. This is something that you could have seen in World War I. Wagons being pulled by horses and so on. This disruption that occurred from an air attack. And notice it was not against an armored unit, it's against a supply column. Because once you run out of food and ammunition, you're no longer combat effective. So destroying these became a key element. As the conflict progressed, the other part of that Ribbentrop-Molotov agreement was that now Russia could enter to support the poor Poles who were now heroically resisting the Germans. Sounds like Lugansk and Donetsk. So the Russian army moved in, took over the eastern half of Poland, pushed the borders of Russia further to the east, and by agreement sealed off this border so that the Polish troops that were withdrawing and trying to get out of harm's way had no place to go, but maybe they could exit down through a small corridor in the south, as you see here, and get to Romania, where they still might be able to get out. In fact, a fair number of the Polish military escaped through that very narrow opening and eventually ended up in England. And some Polish troops fought throughout the rest of the war in England. This just gives an example of some of the things that you could see going on. And down here, the Russians and the Germans are meeting at the agreed upon line. But there was another important lesson that occurred, which warned Britain and France, and that was the bombing of Warsaw. This was a real wake-up call again. Britain and France had been aware of it as a result of the propaganda that occurred in the Spanish Civil War when the German Condor Legion bombed Guernica and appeared to inflict enormous casualties on that town, even though that turned out actually not to be the case. But it emphasized that air power could destroy cities, or at least appear to destroy cities. In addition, although these armored units do not appear particularly impressive in terms of their size or their weaponry, when what you're destroying are wagons and unarmed, infantry that doesn't have any way to resist you other than fire a few bullets at you, this looks rather overpowering. And these units could move fast and get into the rear and disrupt those vulnerable supply columns. A nice little political cartoon. And what's interesting here is that Hitler bowing to Stalin, the scum of the earth, I presume. The bloody assassin of the workers, I presume. So these guys on the surface may have been trying to acknowledge each other. It looks rather friendly, but indeed their philosophies are distinctly different. They truly hate and fear each other, and peace between them is not going to last very long. One of the things that happened that literally was buried for a long time and not revealed until well after the war was how the Russians treated many of the Polish military who had either been captured by them when they took Eastern Poland or had simply gone to Russia to try to escape the Germans and were therefore what we call interred. Well, they literally were interred. At Katyn, it was estimated that 5,000 Polish officers simply were executed. When first discovered by the Germans during World War II, the Germans used this as a propaganda to paint Russia as demonic, capable of all kinds of atrocities. Of course, the Russians denied it and said that it was all the Germans who did this, merely trying to place it at the feet of Russia because of the ongoing conflict between those two nations. But ultimately, after the war, it was learned that this indeed was Russian instigated. The other thing that happened as a consequence of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact and of the conquest of Poland was that the Baltic states were put within the so-called sphere of influence of Russia, which meant basically, you're done. Russia's taken you over. And that indeed became the fact shortly after the war in Poland ended. War in Poland was sometimes called the 1,000-hour war. You remember the first Gulf War, 1991, was the 100-hour war. Well, this was the 1,000-hour war. Complete destruction of Polish resistance. And now it's easy for Russia to take over the Baltic states because they have no way of resisting them. As I had said before, the poster that was later issued, this says issued through, that means you can buy this poster, is that Hitler and Stalin marry over this, and then Hitler's turning this over to Stalin as part of the dowry. The occupation takes place this way. And again, we think, well, okay, you know, we kind of get it. We kind of get it. Britain and France had agreed to guarantee the Polish borders. But as we know, given that there was no way physically Britain or France could do anything to forestall what was happening in Poland, it was almost as though the diplomatic action was taken in order to bring England and France into open conflict with Germany. Germany at the time did not declare war on France or Britain. After they invaded Poland, Britain in particular, but obviously with French agreement, gave Hitler an ultimatum and said, you have to withdraw within 3 days and restore Polish sovereignty. And of course, once you've got your army moving into Poland, you're hardly going to turn around and say, oh, I'm sorry, we didn't mean to do that. Of course, we'll stop. When you know that basically you've already got an agreement that's going to divide Poland, it's a done deal. So it almost becomes a fruitless action on the part of France or Britain. They know they can't help. They can't do anything about it. If we need another example, think about the invasion of Hungary in 1954. The Hungarian Revolution occurs. Hungary says, help us resist Russia. And the West is saying, we can't. I mean, we can't get there from here. It's like that old Yoga Berra saying, we can't get there from here. So the idea that France and Britain basically end up declaring war on Germany over a territory that they can't protect is, in a way, is sort of odd step. But at the same time, you could say, well, if they didn't do that, what was Hitler going to do next? Was he going to invade France, even if Britain and France didn't declare war? There's no real indication that Hitler wanted to invade France and knock Britain out of the war. It was more a matter that he didn't want them threatening his western border. And we'll come to that discussion a little bit later, because what I want us to do in part is to think at that 100,000 foot level, not at the 10,000 foot level. We know what happened, but really the important thing is, why did it happen? And what were the goals that the countries were attempting to gain by saying that this conflict in Eastern Europe must of necessity involve France and Britain? Now, we're coming to a break time here shortly, but I just want to point out that Russian occupation in Estonia, for example, was not benign. 60,000 Estonians executed or deported. Most historians don't even mention anything like this, other than just say that the Baltic states fell to Russian occupation. And similar attacks against the population were carried out in Latvia and Lithuania. Let's just take 1 minute. I'll see if anyone has any questions, then we'll take a short break if that's acceptable to people. But if you have any questions at all, please, or comments, I mean, it's not just questions, but you people have read, experienced, understand a lot of these things, and please join in. or take a break.
Um, I guess, what I think is how easy it is to forget all this stuff.
It is. And I think the other part of this is that we have been fortunate enough in our lifetimes not to experience war within our nation. So it's hard for us sometimes to think of what it must have been like for people who had, through this entire part of the world, this entire part of Europe, had experienced a conflict in World War I that was so utterly devastating in comparison to what had been the case in the 1800s, for example, where there had been European conflicts, but they just didn't rise to this level that we saw in World War I. And then on top of it, to have the Depression.
Yeah.
And the economic and political chaos that existed through the 20s and 30s as the various ideologies that we discussed struggled for dominance within the various nations. To be willing to take this step in the face of all that is sometimes just hard to fathom. It really is. And the more that I looked at trying to put together this set of lectures, the more I found myself not just thinking about today, as I've obviously made a number of references to Ukraine and things of that sort, or to China and China's ambitions in the South China Sea and the first and second island chain and the Belt and Roads Initiative and their investments in Africa and South America. And just recently I heard the Chinese own $2 billion worth of agricultural land in the United States. I mean, $2 billion
I've heard that,
worth,
yeah.
you know, of our agriculture. You think, what? But these kinds of things we look at and say, we don't want to fight over those things. And we look at the destruction in Ukraine, and regardless of how that's going to turn out, what ultimate solution is achieved there, we look at it and say, you've just destroyed so much stuff. You've displaced so many people. You've disrupted the economy and the social and political structure of a nation, even if they're successful in resisting the Russian incursions. Why would you do that? I mean, that just doesn't make real sense. And that's why, in terms of looking at the decisions by France and England in supporting Poland, to the extent that they're acknowledging that this is war. In fact, they declare war on Germany, not the other way around, is an interesting step. What was the threat they saw from accepting German dominance in Central Europe? Where did they think that would go? And they made their decisions, hopefully based on some intelligence that they had gotten from within Germany itself. But at the same time, it's hard to piece together in the histories that Hitler wanted to go to war with Britain and France. I've seen a lot that said he didn't want to, that indeed he tried to reach an accommodation with them at different times, but it just wasn't happening. And it's an interesting decision, and it makes it easier for me, again, in my interpretation. And remember, that's what I do with this. I present facts and then I interpret everything in my own way. for the United States to stay out of this. Say, listen, you idiots in Europe have been fighting each other for centuries. Figure it out. But the last conflict was really destructive, and you got us involved in that, and we took thousands of dead and several 100,000 wounded, and you guys just aren't worth it. You just aren't. So we're staying out of this. And it's easy to see how that perception can persist even up to the current time. If you guys can't settle your hash, why should we? This is your problem. You figure it out. All right, well, we'll resume. I think that most everybody is back. The other conflict that erupted very soon after the loss of Poland to Russia and Germany was the Russo-Finnish War, sometimes called the Winter War, but this particular conflict was occasioned in part by Stalin's paranoia over what was coming, what he feared would come. Because remember that what I'd said just a bit earlier was Stalin and Hitler did not trust each other. The pact was purely a pact to buy time for both nations and to create buffer zones in case one would attack the other. Hitler was the more aggressive in terms of this. He was looking to go further east at the expense of Russia, and in time wanted to topple communism, which he felt was the biggest ideological threat to his Nazi ideology. But at the same time, Hitler knew he couldn't afford, or certainly didn't want to end up with a fight on two fronts. And that was part of the reason for the pact, in case Britain and France decided to declare war, which, as we just talked about, they did. Now, at least temporarily, it looks as though Germany has at least a secure, relatively peaceful Eastern Front, and they can begin to turn their attention now to France and Britain. The period of time between the end of the conflict in Poland and the outbreak of war against France and Britain, which doesn't occur until May of 1940, is called the Phony War. Part of the reason for that has to do with the structure of the Maginot Line, which meant German attacks could not really occur across the German-French border. And Russian troops, the mobile troops, the maneuver troops, were in the east. They had to all be brought back to the west, and they had to be reconditioned, reorganized, and restructured if there was going to be an open conflict to the west. Hitler felt fairly confident that France would not attack through Belgium and or the Netherlands, because that would trigger Belgian and Netherlands opposition. They would resist the way they had resisted Germany in World War I. So they felt reasonably confident they would have time to shift their forces back. But once they had established themselves on their western border, hopefully that would tell France and Britain time to accommodate. So Germany made no real offensive maneuvers against France and Britain. They didn't start bombing French cities or depots or anything of that sort. And that's why it was called the Phony War. Stalin, on the other hand, had a different problem. He had just finished the conflict with Japan, and he had settled, from his perspective, his far eastern flank. So now he began to think, the biggest threat I face is no longer a concern about Japan cutting me off from the Far East Pacific Fleet and basically taking over the only warm water port I have left over that way, I can still receive trade and supplies and things coming through there because Russia and Japan did not declare war on each other. Therefore, commerce could continue. But I can now concentrate my efforts on the western flank. I can move the defenses, which I had been creating in the Russian border prior to taking Poland, prior to taking the Baltic states. I can move my defenses further west. But there's still one problem. And that is that during the interwar years, Finland and Russia had been at odds with each other, and the Finns had basically eliminated the Communist Party in Russia. And they had become much more autonomous in their dealings with the rest of the world and with Russia than had been the case previously. That meant that the Finnish border was very close to what was previously called St. Petersburg, now was called Leningrad. Now, while the capital of Russia had been moved to Moscow in the 1920s, when Lenin moved it to get out of St. Petersburg, which was in chaos at the time, yet Leningrad was still a very important city and was right next to the major Baltic Russian fleet. So this area was economically important, it was demographically important, and he had to find a way to protect it. So, like most things, the first step will be diplomacy. And in this, Stalin offered Finland certain concessions if the Finns would allow their border to be pushed back further west, giving a sort of breathing room around Leningrad. In addition, in the far north, it was important for Russia to move the Finnish border further west to protect the sea routes that were going to come around and eventually land at Murmansk and Archangel, and would be supply routes to the rest of the world, even though in time those areas could be frozen and cut off. So in this situation, the following offers were made, and we see them here. But in doing so, if Finland's going to move its borders further to the west on the Karelian Isthmus between Lake Ladoga and the Gulf of Finland and that region where the naval fleet was at Kronstadt, it meant that the fortifications the Finns had built there very specifically to resist Russian incursions would now all have to be dismantled and moved away. It sounds a little bit like Russia and Ukraine. You got to move in order to give us this territory and protect us. Well, counteroffers were made back and forth. Short story, negotiations fail. Now you need a cause for war. We've heard this term in relationship to Ukraine recently called the false flag, which actually is derived from naval conflicts back in the days of wooden ships and iron men. You put the wrong flag up on your ship, you get close to your opponent, you drop the flag, you put up your own flag, and then you attack and force its surrender. Well, in this case, a Soviet border village allegedly was attacked by the Finns, who had no particular reason to want to attack it. And then Russia says, oh, you've been attacking us, so we're going to attack you. Well, remember that Russian military had been gutted, their leadership destroyed, and they were in the process of rebuilding. Shaposhnikov had tried to convince Stalin, just hold off a little bit. Look at the time frame here, November 30, and you're in the north, all right? Shaposhnikov is saying, listen, this is just the wrong time to take on Finland. Yeah, they're not a big country. Yes, they don't have a great military, but logistically, this is just not a good idea. You'll see here that the political leader, Zanoff, and the military leader, who was actually given charge of the initial attack, Meretskov, end up saying, listen, first of all, the logistical problems for attacking Finland are minimal because there's Leningrad, or 20 miles from the front. That's not a big deal. And secondly, the Finns are relatively small in number. We can really overrun them. We don't have to conquer the entire country. We will just simply drive the border back and force concessions that give us the Gulf of Finland, give us control over the places we need to control to protect that northern flank. Well, it didn't quite turn out that way. Voroshilov also was the commander of the forces there. You'll notice that he was removed from command in 1940. These people all actually managed to survive these defeats that took place and remain in power in the Soviet military for at least a time afterward. General Mannerheim, the Finnish leader at this time, for whom the defensive line north of Leningrad was named, it was called the Mannerheim Line, recognized that he had very limited combat power to resist what everyone anticipated was a Russian juggernaut. And as a result, had to modify the tactics that would be used against the Russians that were consistent with the weaponry they had. This goes back again to my discussion about the cycle of technology, tactics, and technology. And in this particular case, Mannerheim did a masterful job of this, recognizing that Russian forces were so dominant that the possibility of long-term success was very, very poor. What he had hoped is to make it such a punishing affair for the Russians that they would indeed lessen the concessions being demanded of Finland. The major routes of attack were going to be up the Karelian Isthmus here and north of Lake Ladoga. The reason I show these lines has to do with what the borders were and what was going to happen. And for some reason, my coloring didn't show up. This should be a red arrow here, for example. But this red line demonstrates it more clearly that the Russians eventually took a lot of the territory they had demanded from Finland and then took a little bit more on top of it. And they also gained control of some of these islands here so that they could use this Gulf openly. Remember, they controlled Estonia and Latvia as well at this point. The initial attacks I show here because in spite of the busyness of this particular slide, most Westerners, and I'm not being critical of anyone, are unfamiliar with this particular conflict and how it had an impact on the war itself as the war continued, because it really did have some profound implications. But in this regard, the Finns had concentrated themselves down here north of Leningrad, which is here. The Russians had concentrated down there, but with superior manpower, the Russians also concentrated heavily here and would come in north of Lake Ladoga. But look at all the water that's here, okay? An enormous amount of water. Well, what difference does that make? In wintertime, this is all going to freeze. So it actually doesn't become the obstacle that it's going to be when you hit the spring. So the timing of your offensive becomes important. And one of the reasons the Russians chose to attack in November was that these waterways were going to freeze up. They wouldn't be the obstacles, they would be later. If we look at the conflict in Ukraine, one of the things that was emphasized in some of the early reports was how the Russian armor would get bogged down when off-road into the mud. A typical finding in that part of the world that has an enormous effect later on the German war against Russia. But the Russians looked at this and said, all this water, if this is water, then we're channeled and we're vulnerable. But if it's frozen, and this would be deep freezes, the temperatures here would drop well below zero and stay there consistently for a period of time. The ice would be thick enough to bear even tanks. So choosing in winter, maybe not such a bad idea, and your lines of support are not very long. Again, looks like an advantage. Notice also up here, they concentrate a heavy set of units here because they need to protect Murmansk and they want to drive all the way over to Petsamo. So what actually happens? The initial attacks that occur up the isthmus break through the frontier lines that you see and begin to drive up against the main line of resistance. And by coming up against this line of resistance, where there are dug-in forces that are designed specifically to channel the attacks in particular ways, you can bring concentrated firepower against those heads of these columns, where it's harder to displace your columns into a broad area of attack and punch through. If the water is not frozen sufficiently, this itself becomes an enormous barrier, and you've only got a few bridges to get across, which if blown, basically limit your ability to maneuver at all. So this resistance becomes important in the very opening session. What else happens? The Russian attack north of Lake Ladoga here begins to run into similar difficulties, as does an attack that's beginning to cut across the waste. There's a short distance between here and here, and if the Russians can penetrate all the way to here and cut Finland in two, that'll force an end to the conflict rather quickly. What happens, again, showing here, is that the attacks begin to stall. And in the north of Lake Ladoga, the Russians begin to traverse some difficult terrain, but they begin to run into difficulties as they hit up against very limited defenses in this particular region, but they're trying to turn the flank. If they can get around through here and even through this corridor here where there isn't a lot of the water, then they can turn that Mannerheim line down and defeat Finland. How did the Finns respond? The Russians get strung out on these roads as they cross through here. And even with their limited weaponry, again, like Ukraine, once you're strung out on a road like this, the Finns were able to cut the road in a number of different locations. They didn't have to occupy it. What they would do is they could destroy a vehicle at this end and destroy a vehicle here, and that would block the road. It'd make it hard to go off and drive around it or get it off the road in order to continue on. These little sections were called moti, and it allowed the Finns to destroy each of them in detail. In addition, the Russian troops that were in these columns were not well trained, much like, again, what we were seeing in Ukraine. And because they were not well trained, they didn't have enough initiative to be able to respond to these kinds of attacks, which were really carried out by relatively small units. And when this happens, your casualties mount enormously. And this shows you an example. Now, Russia could certainly take those kinds of casualties. They had a manpower superiority that was enormous compared to the Finns. But at the same time, psychologically, this is devastating. This is really bad news. And it occurred in several particular locations where Russian forces were simply cut off and then ultimately destroyed in the process. And this threw the Russian army back from any great possibility they had of ending this war in 2 weeks. Here again, it shows these are Russian tanks on a road. They're caught. Notice the proximity of trees, how close they are. So even if you have what appears to be superior firepower individually, you haven't got the range to employ this. You can't shoot out 500 meters or 1,000 meters to take out an opponent. He's within 100 yards of you. And if he has something that's capable of knocking a tread off, for example, he's going to immobilize that tank. He doesn't even have to destroy it, but you can't go anywhere. You're stuck. Here's another example. Coming down the snow-laden road, forests, embankments. If you slide off here, you might just slide off all the way into the woods and just turn over. Look at the supply wagon. And remember that the Russian military, like the German military, at this time was not heavily motorized. A lot of it depended on people literally slogging through the snow on skis or having horses with wagons. But armor at least could navigate on the roads and in snow until the snow became deep enough, or you blew a hole in the road and got a ditch that the tank couldn't traverse, and so on. So the tactics were adjusted for your weapons. The weapons allowed you to engage with certain tactics. Stalin was not happy, clearly. And he appointed Timoshenko to take over and settle this issue. And in doing so, Timoshenko demonstrated that he had learned lessons, not just from this particular conflict and the disasters that were occurring to Russian forces, but he had learned a great deal from World War I and from the Russian Civil War. And as a result of this early disaster in November and December and January, Timoshenko went to Stalin and said, if you give me what I want and allow me to conduct the fighting the way I want to, then in a sense, I can guarantee that we will win. Now, he wants to do this while it's still a deep freeze, because once you get to April and all of this begins to thaw, then all these little spots that you see here become barriers to movement. So again, Timoshenko has a timeline that he's looking at that's critical for him, but it's not one that's imposed by Stalin. And as a result, he brings up enormous reinforcements, not just in terms of numbers, but in forms of artillery and more mobile units. And he is actually able to devastate the Mannerheim line and drive on into into Finland. He also attacks across the ice in some locations and captures a bunch of little islands, which will give Russia control of the Gulf of Finland, will keep this route under their control, and when Finland is forced to surrender, will force acknowledgement that Russia will continue to control these territories with the surrender of Finland. And notice this up here as well. Thank you, sweets. So I showed this because I think it's just an interesting example of the kinds of things that were happening prior to what most of us think about is the real European war. This was not a small conflict. Finnish strength, notice they only had 32 tanks and 114 aircraft, many of which were obsolete, many of which were lost very early in the conflict. So Russia had marked air superiority, but because their doctrine had not incorporated their air superiority as well as had the Germans when they were fighting in Poland in assisting their land forces, these aircraft might have fly around Finland a good place and knock down other aircraft or even attack some cities, but they didn't have a coherent system for engaging with the frontline troops that needed to breach the defenses. But notice the number of tanks. That's an extraordinary number. You'd think, just look at the numbers. Finland should be gone in a week. This shouldn't be hard. And yet we just saw why that didn't happen. Because of poor doctrine, poor training, bad terrain. Finnish casualties, all right. About 26,000 dead or missing, 43,000 wounded, 1,100 captured. They lost nearly all their tanks. They lost nearly all their aircraft, and so on. 70,000 total casualties. But that represents about 1/4 of the soldiers, 1/4 to 1/5. When you're at the 20 to 25% loss ratio, you're in trouble. Your combat efficiency drops off markedly. And on top of it, while Finland was getting some supplies from England and France, Norway and Sweden were a barrier to getting those supplies into Finland. In fact, there'd been movement diplomatically on the part of England and France to see if they could actually send troops across into Finland, across Norway and Sweden. But Norway and Sweden said, you got to be kidding me. We're not going to do this. We're not going to get involved in this fight. We certainly aren't going to end up in war with Russia. You got to be out of your mind. So it didn't happen. Notice the Russian casualties were substantially greater, 2 to 3 times the number, right? But they could sustain it. Their military was so much larger, their population on which they could draw so much greater, that they could take these losses and still come out on top. So in this particular section, I'm going to just take a quick break, not to have people leave and wander off, but just to emphasize a couple of simple points. That is, although the outbreak of the European war occurs on September 1st, when Germany invades Poland and then is given an ultimatum and told by France and Britain, if you don't stop, we're going to war, and then they do. There's a series of conflicts that occur which do not appear to be of all that great significance in determining the rest of the war. And yet, why did I spend this time on Finland? There are a couple of reasons. It wasn't just that it occurred, and often we're completely ignorant of what happened during that particular set of almost 6 months. But more importantly, there was a particular message. And the message was that the Russian military was inefficient. It didn't function well in armed conflict, in spite of its numbers, in spite of the large number of tanks. And 6,000? It's hard to imagine that. All those aircraft and so on. When it came to crunch time, the military did not function well. The only reason that Tymoshenko was able to crush the Finns was not only had the Finns been beaten on for several months, but he mustered such overwhelming power on a very limited front from which the Finns could not maneuver sufficiently anymore, that the end was basically determined. But now Britain and France see Russia as an aggressor. This is more than just the aggression of occupying Eastern Poland. And they didn't know what was happening in the Baltic countries, though they knew the Russians were occupying them. They didn't know what was happening to the population. But they certainly weren't looking on France or on Russia as a friend. From their perspective, Russia was not quite a combatant in the war against Germany that they had initiated by declaring war shortly after Poland was attacked. But they looked at Russian aggression in Finland and said, are they going to stop there? Are they going to continue to try to march further west? Are they going to threaten Sweden and ultimately Norway? And if they threaten Norway, then that's going to expose the eastern flank of England, because now it's not very far across the North Sea for Russia to beat on England. So they see this as a real danger, something that is going to inhibit their relationship with Russia over the next year and a half. Secondly, Germany looks at this performance. Now, Russia coming in to occupy Eastern Poland's a piece of cake. There's basically no resistance. So there isn't any direct challenge to Russian military capability that the Poles are able to muster. But when they see how Russia performs against Finland, says Hitler, they are not any good. They may have a big army, but they don't know how to fight. We do. So when push comes to shove, as it will, we can beat them handily. And Russia is a rotten structure anyway. It is clear from their history that the oppression of the communist regime is so profound that Russia will topple like a rotten structure that it is. Okay, so that's the lesson that is being seen globally. The United States, again, watches from afar, is not involved directly, but we're watching and we're thinking, what a mess that place is over in Europe. We want nothing to do with this. There's no way we're going to end up fighting with Russia. There's no way we want to end up fighting with Germany. We got enough concern with what's going on in the Pacific. So now Britain is basically stuck. As we talked about, under Baldwin and then Chamberlain, diplomatic approaches to preventing conflict were ongoing. There was attempts to pry one nation away from supporting another to achieve a balance of power. But the ideologies were beginning to take over in Germany and Russia and Italy. And the ideology that underpinned France and England and the United States just wasn't that powerful enough in its appearance that it looked as though we could resist. The idea was constantly find a diplomatic solution. The one person who really felt that war was going to come was this guy. But he had been chastised for his relatively poor performance as the first Sea Lord in World War I and the Gallipoli disaster that took place under his initiative. And while he became the first Sea Lord in 39 to 40 due to his political strength and later prime minister, he still was considered a marginal character. And it was not felt that he had much that he could offer in terms of preparing Britain. Soon after the conflict, and this is one of the few things that did happen where there was direct fighting between Britain and Germany, was the sailing of the Graf Spee pocket battleship. This was to be a commerce raider, somewhat analogous to what happened in World War I when the German Pacific Fleet was brought to the Atlantic, beat up a British fleet off Colonel, and then was crushed at the Falklands. The idea here was that this particular ship would get out into the Atlantic, it would raid, and it did. As you can see from the lines that are drawn here, she used her superior gunnery to destroy anything that was inferior to her, but she also had considerable speed and as a result could outrun pretty much anybody, until she was basically misled, if you will, by her own observation, and took on 3 different British ships. While she damaged them heavily, she didn't utterly destroy them, and she herself took enough damage that Langsdorff, her captain, took her into Montevideo, Uruguay. Now, Uruguay was neutral, and under neutral policies, you could only stay there for 24 hours, and then you had to leave. Langsdorff tried to bargain for additional time to repair his ship so he could get her back out to sea and hopefully get her home. But the British had people there who were watching what was going on, had alerted the Admiralty, and were able to help get other ships directed to Montevideo to engage the Graf Spee if she tried to exit. Langsdorff, recognizing what was happening, that he could not be given enough time, he got it up to 72 hours from the 24, but he just felt that there was no way he was going to be able to escape. So instead, he left off nearly all of his crew in Montevideo, where they were interned and remained pretty much for the end of the war, took the ship out to sea and scuttled her. And I'm sorry about the spelling, there's supposed to be 2 T's, and committed suicide. He went down with the ship himself. Now, the other ship that we hear about is the Bismarck. The Bismarck and the Tirpitz were the 2 large ships that Germany created that also were to be surface raiders. I'm not going to spend much time talking about the Bismarck or the Tirpitz, other than that you know the story. The Bismarck got out into the Atlantic, sank the hood, blew up with, I think, 1 survivor out of the entire ship's complement. The reason I bring this up is that everybody talks about how enormously powerful the Bismarck was. And it was only by luck that a torpedo struck her rudder and made her run in circles that she was eventually brought down by the British fleet. She had 15-inch guns. You remember the Yamato? 18.1-inch guns. 50,000 tons fully loaded. The Yamato was 70,000. So what we're seeing is that the Bismarck comparatively was a powerful ship, but compared to what even the Japanese were putting together, was not all that powerful. Indeed, the turrets here at 14.2 inches are almost half of what the Yamato had on her turrets. The reason you put very heavy armor on your turrets is that's where your guns are. And you don't want your guns disabled. You don't want the ammunition hoists blown up and powder magazines blowing up. So you put a great deal of power into those turrets. And comparatively, the Bismarck is about half of what the other was. Now, the war begins in earnest. We'll take a little time for this to get us to the opening elements. And then we'll probably stop at that point and save the last 2 lectures to take us up to the critical point of when I say global war develops. And I'm going to be skirting over a number of different things in doing that, because of what happens in 1941 is so enormous that I don't want to spend much time on it, because it really deserves a great deal of attention in and of itself. As spring rolls around, the weather's improved, and the Germans have brought a great many of their forces that they used to conquer Poland back to the west. They now prepare themselves for an open conflict with France and England. Diplomatic initiatives, particularly on the part of Hitler, to try to get a diplomatic solution to the war, are unsuccessful. So what's the deal? Eventually, Hitler is alarmed by one particular incident that takes place along the Norwegian coast, and that's when a ship called the Altmark is captured by the British in Norwegian waters. And the Altmark contained some British sailors who had been picked up after their ships were sunk by German raiders, including some submarines. And the Altmark was coming down the Norwegian coastline as a neutral country and was intercepted by the British in Norwegian territorial waters. This is a breach of sovereignty. Hitler becomes alarmed because he requires much of the iron that is mined in Sweden, which isn't shipped down by rail to Sweden, down to its southern ports where it can be transported easily across the Baltic. Instead, it's shifted across to the far north of Norway to a town called Narvik, a port. And there it's loaded on transport and then comes down the coast of Norway where it's delivered to Germany. Hitler sees that taking the Altmark is a sign that the British are willing to violate Norwegian territory and could cut off that route. And he can't afford to let that happen. So what is he going to do? Well, he knows that there's a relatively strong, but certainly not dominant, Nazi-oriented party in Norway. And he also knows that Denmark is relatively militarily insignificant. So again, Hitler takes the action that he's going to prevent the British from not just interrupting the supply line, but from actually invading Norway. This becomes a real possibility in his mind. And indeed, in some ways, the British had already hinted at it by saying they were going to try to send troops to assist Finland by crossing through Norway and Sweden. So he's got a real reason to be concerned. And if the British Navy is willing to violate Norwegian coastal waters, then why wouldn't the Brits also occupy important islands along the Norwegian coast where they could interdict and prevent any shipments of iron? So what do? Norway isn't going to sign itself over to German occupation, so it has to be occupied. But to get there, you got to go by water or by air. There's no land bridge that you can use. So this again becomes a very complex organization that requires the Navy, the Air Force, and the Army to cooperate completely if this is to be successful. And they have to do it in the face of what they already know is a dominant British Navy. So speed and secrecy become critical. And Hitler directs that this will happen. In addition, simply taking Norway isn't sufficient. He's got to take Denmark as well, because of the geographic issues that are involved. So he's got to plan an overland campaign, an air campaign, and a naval campaign, and an amphibious campaign of sorts. And that kind of complexity is just extraordinary to pull off. Denmark goes under in about 6 hours. There is practically nothing they can do to resist the German onslaught. And once the border's breached, basically Denmark surrenders. Okay, big deal. What does that really gain you? Not a lot when it comes to taking Norway. Norway's a much more complicated issue. In fact, there's an interesting movie on Netflix about that, King Haakon, who is in charge. This gives you an idea of the relative threats that are offered depending upon your aircraft and where they're based, and the dangers that you encounter if you're trying to go from Germany to Norway, or if Norway is occupied by Germany. And you can begin to see that if you want to move naval units up through here, or even air power through here, you're subject to being caught by a substantial air force. And speed is the only way you're going to survive that. The Germans have some naval armament that they can bring to the fray, but they don't have the dominant naval power that Britain has. So again, the restrictions and the dangers that the Germans face in conducting this operation is enormous. Here is one of their major remaining battleships, if you will, and I don't mean the word battleship in the technical sense. This is a German cruiser. It has 8-inch guns. Yeah, the range is 20.8 miles, but you got a shell weight of only 270 pounds. Again, I go back to the Bismarck, or I go back to the Amato and think of the weight of those shells hitting something. One of those shells is going to be devastating when it hits a ship of this sort. But look at how many sites Germany is going to attack. And in the course of it, what the British are also preparing to do quite literally at the same time. The British actually were planning to invade Norway. They actually had plans afoot and were working to it. But the Germans happened to get in first. And when they did, then they were eventually able to forestall the British. King Haakon VII, who had actually been elected to become the King of Norway, and I think he came from Denmark, if I remember correctly, with his family, was the symbol of resistance to the German invasion. And this busy map kind of shows you all of the different things that were happening. But the Germans landed at several parts along the coast of Norway. They attempted to attack Oslo, where the Blucher was sunk by shore batteries, but they were able to circumvent it anyway and begin to cut Oslo off, and King Haakon ran north until eventually he was nearly trapped and got away to England. And they also landed parachutists to occupy airfields so that they could bring in transports, bringing additional ground troops and logistical support. Remember what I said, that if you can land a force somewhere, but if you can't supply it, it quickly runs out of ammunition and food, and it becomes combat ineffective. So the Germans had to work very quickly, but in a very organized fashion, to sustain their ground troops, because once they landed, it was pretty clear the British Navy was going to intercede and make it extremely painful for what remained of the German Navy to survive. In fact, up in the Narvik region, I think the Germans lost all of their destroyers. I think they had 10 destroyers sunk by the British up there. And when your Navy isn't very big to begin with, this is a critical loss. The conflict went on for a considerable period of time. The British were eventually thrown back, and pretty much all of the places where they landed, they eventually were withdrawn. The Norwegian army put up a kind of a resistance, the terrain being very, very difficult, of course, but ultimately everything collapsed for them. This is the Blucher, sunk by shore batteries. So these ships were sacrificed in order to try to take over. But here's the other part that, again, I just like to show some of these slides. First, it shows you how incredibly difficult this terrain is. You look at the mountains on either side, there's snow still all over the place, but they're bicycles. This isn't a heavily motorized army. A lot of the German support required things like horses and wagons. Not anything like the United States forces that eventually got into the fray. British prisoners of war captured, taken down, interred, sent to POW camps, many of the Norwegians. Similarly, what happened in terms of the government? Well, we have a term that's derived from this guy, Quisling. That's a term that's used in the English language to describe a traitor. Quisling was actually a politician who supported Nazi ideology. He wasn't a German, he was a Norwegian. And like many who supported the Nazi party in various countries, including Czechoslovakia and Hungary and other places of that sort, became a sort of figurehead for German authority. This is the guy who actually ran the country for a period of time, but in 1942 eventually turned it over when he was needed elsewhere, and Norway's pretty much under German control, absolutely. Now, what about a couple of other places we don't hear about? Greenland and Iceland. Now, the reason I bring these up is that, remember, the United States is not in the war yet. Britain sees that communication supplies with Canada and the United States are going to be critical, just as they were in World War I. If, with the collapse of Denmark, which owns Iceland and Greenland, now allows German forces to come take Iceland and Greenland, then it will become possible for the Germans to interdict at least a good portion of that supply route that's coming from North America. And Britain isn't about to accept, accept that. On top of it, the United States also isn't really ready to accept German domination. We're not in the war, okay? But Roosevelt is looking down the road long enough to say German occupation of these two places is not in our best interest by far. So what happens? Well, Britain says, it's not acceptable, we're going to take them. So with or without the cooperation of the local governments, which largely ended up being cooperative because the local governments wanted nothing to do with German occupation, the British are able to establish bases and a form of resistance so that any attempts by the Germans to occupy these regions is deflected. For us, that is the United States, the primary use was as stopping places for the transfer of aircraft from North America to England, which required a stopping off place. Most of them were not capable of making it in a single flight. And weather stations, because of the weather patterns that existed in this region, would tell you what was going to be happening in England and Europe. Iceland gets occupied by Britain in May of 1940. And at this particular time, they actually, before we're in the war, transferred the occupation of Greenland and Iceland to the United States. So they can free up what troops they use, particularly in Iceland, to get them back to the British Isles. Because if you'll notice that date, May 1940, May is when Germany attacks Belgium, Holland, and France and Britain in the West. And with the collapse that occurs, which I'll leave to the next set of lectures, England now says, uh-oh, the home islands are threatened. We still need Iceland to be friendly, but we need those troops. And there's a whole set of negotiations that take place between the Roosevelt administration and then Churchill in June to remove the British troops and get them back to the homeland where they can help support the defense. I'll stop here. It's getting close to the end anyway. I'll certainly stick around if anyone wants to chat or ask questions. Happy to do it. And Cheryl, I guess if you want to end recording, I'll leave it to your discretion. If you want to record questions or comments, that's fine. If not, you end it at your pleasure.
I'll leave it on a little bit longer and see if there's any, like, I'll leave it on till 8.
Anybody?
That is, if there's any questions.
Anything new or different about what I've told you? Let me put it in that context as a question to all of you. Is this all, oh yeah, I know all this, you've just kind of reinforced what I already knew, or is there something new or different, different interpretations, whatever?
I hardly knew any of it.
John, I'm sorry, what?
I said I hardly knew any of it.
Oh, okay. Well, that's gratifying.
Sir, I certainly didn't know anything about Finland. That's a real eye opener there.
I didn't know about Greenland or Iceland. That was new to me.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm glad that something new has come across. Now you don't have to go get a book out. What I also hope will happen, and again, these are, small things, as you know, I'm drawing comparisons to current situations. But even if you want to go back and read some of these histories, what I find myself doing more and more since I've started doing these lectures from way back when, is when I read the introduction or the preface to a book, and I begin to get a clearer understanding than I had thought I had by what the author's intent was. First, why is he writing this book? What is he hoping to bring out that is not general knowledge anyway? And therefore, I'm not just reading events, I'm reading the interpretation of those events. And one of the real joys, if you will, for me to go through this kind of thing is to take some of these events and interpret them, to look at their significance and impact on what happened then, the decisions that were made, how these events unfolded, but then so what? I mean, if it's just all in the past, so what? It's really, how does that matter today? And I think it's just revealing to be able to say, boy, we've been down this road before with some variations. Are we going to behave differently? Not the idea of repeating mistakes necessarily, but what are we learning? And how are we going to adjust? Because the presence of nuclear weapons completely changes the equation in how we're going to engage with another nuclear power. But back in those days, their fear of aircraft flying over their cities and devastating their cities was a sort of nuclear power. And are you going to risk a conflict with a nation that can blow up all your cities and maybe cut off your supply so you're going to starve to death, as England almost did in World War I? Those are the real considerations. And as human beings, when we look at our leaders, we sometimes forget that they're human beings with failings, and we can lay them at anyone's feet. We all share them. We all know about them. But when it comes to being saddled with the responsibilities of governing, then a very cold-hearted approach has to be taken. In a sense, you can't get down into the human suffering. You're looking at national interests. You're looking at the welfare and protection of your society, your culture, your future. And what cannot stand in the way is just emotion. You have to be almost brutal in the way you think about how you're going to react.
Dory has a comment in the chat.
Sure, Dory. Where are you?
I don't know.
Did we lose her?
I don't know. It says, it's understood that a country the size of Russia could sustain huge personal losses in conflicts personnel. How would the fact that Stalin purged opponents and put a police state in place play into the ability to treat troops as cannon fodder?
That's an excellent point. And again, it actually fits in with what I was just saying about the brutal nature of governance. Now, that doesn't mean when we look at our leaders being cold-hearted that they become psychopaths and regard human beings as worthless. But in a way, the ideology that underpinned communism as it was used in Russia and as it was used subsequently in China and in North Korea, or Nazism or fascism in those respective countries, meant the individual was nothing more than an asset. Consider it like, a dollar. And you either spend it or you don't spend it. You spend it wisely or you squander it. So from Stalin's perspective, when it came to using humans, they were simply assets. His sense of humanity was practically zero. He was willing to ignore any human emotion towards even his own family in terms of decisions that he would make. And that was because he was so deeply invested in the ideology that, in a sense, he did not separate himself from his ideology, the same way that Hitler did not separate himself from his ideology, that they were one and the same, that even his own personal feelings were of no importance. And you could sacrifice anybody, and we'll see when eventually, if we ever continue these lectures on, in the Russian-German conflict. And the same held true in Japan, that there was a sort of basic lack of humanism, of human empathy that governed how they behaved, not only towards those nations they conquered, but towards their own people, that it was perfectly okay. In fact, it was the right thing to sacrifice yourself in incomprehensible fashions that allowed these conflicts to continue the way they did and achieve the level of brutality that they did. And this was more than just taking retribution against a civilian who picks up a weapon and starts shooting at you and has therefore abrogated the laws of war. These are institutional decisions that are made in the most cold-hearted, inhumane way we can possibly imagine. And the people who were in charge just beggar the imagination or even the definition of psychopath. They're just they just aren't humans in the way in which we think of human beings.
Mm.
Well, folks, on that happy note, we can all indulge in